I'm Jed Kolko, Chief Economist at Indeed, the world's #1 job site. As Chief Economist at Indeed, I lead a team of economists, researchers, and editorial folks, a global team all around the world, where we look at what's happening in the labor market based on what we see on our own site, as well as what we see in publicly available data. It's a pleasure to join you today. I'm going to be talking first about the current picture, about what we're seeing about the labor market. Then the larger picture, where I think the labor market might be going even after we get past this acute phase of the pandemic. Then I'd like to talk about one of the possibly enduring shifts that we've seen from the pandemic, and that is the move to remote work, and what that means for the labor market and also what it means for recruiting. And then finally, I would like to end with some thoughts about what the pandemic and the shift to remote work mean for diversity, inclusion, and inequality. I think what we are experiencing today in terms of the pandemic could bring lots of changes, some good, some concerning, in our efforts to become more inclusive and to narrow some of the wide gaps in opportunity that we see in society. But first, I'd like to start with the current picture of what we're seeing in the labor market. One of the ways that Indeed tracks the labor market during this pandemic is to look at what's happened to job postings. Across all our markets, we see a pretty comprehensive set of job postings on our site. So we're able to see the types of jobs that employers are looking for, what sectors they're in, the regions they're in, and we can track that over time. As of early September, job postings in the US were down by about 20% relative to where they were last year. That's been pretty stable throughout the past 6 weeks. There was a big initial decline in the spring, some rebound over the summer, but that rebound has flattened out in the last month and a half or so. And so job postings in the US are down by about a fifth, about 20%. In other places, the picture looks worse. In the UK, job postings are down still around half. And there's been much less of a rebound in the UK than we've seen in the US. There are a lot of big differences when you look across countries. These differences depend on the different job mix, whether different markets have lots of jobs that people can do from home. It also depends on the types of government policies that different national and local governments have put in place, and whether they're designed to help workers or businesses or localities or some combination. What this pandemic looks like is a combination of a shift in economic activity from some types of spending and activity to others, as well as a slowdown in activity overall. And finally, a lot of uncertainty about what might be coming next. So the shift is a shift in spending, both by people and businesses, really tied to this stay-at-home economy. People are eating out less in restaurants. They're cooking more at home. They are traveling less or not at all. Some might be spending more instead on home improvements. These shifts have benefited a few sectors, but hurt lots of others, especially those that really needed to shut down in order to help stop the spread of the virus. Now, in addition to these shifts, there's also a broader economic slowdown. Lots of people have lost their jobs permanently or out of work temporarily. Many have had a loss of income. That means less consumer spending. Lots of businesses have already decided that they're not going to make it through the pandemic. These effects ripple across the economy. The flight attendant that loses their job will be shopping less, which hurts the local retailer, which in turn might hurt the accountant that local retailer used to do their books. And the retailer or the accountant might decide not to renew their lease, which hurts the property owner, the janitorial services that cleans that building, and so on. So the sectors in the economy are all related, even though there's also been a shift from some sectors to others. And on top of all of this, there's so much uncertainty. Uncertainty about how long this slowdown might go, whether these shifts are permanent, and uncertainty just about everything else. This combination of shifts, slowdown, and uncertainty affects different parts of the labor market in different ways. I tend to look at 4 different sectors in this pandemic, each of which have gone in different directions over the past few months. First of the 4 sectors is a small group of winners. These are companies or sectors that have done well because they support the stay-at-home economy. Delivery and online shopping services like Amazon, large superstores and grocery stores, building supply centers, certain kind of retail that people are spending more at as they spend their time at home. Technologies like Zoom, as well as some other sectors, have actually done better in this pandemic than they have before the pandemic. Those companies have done a lot of hiring during this period, but they are, of course, the exception. Most companies in most sectors have suffered in this pandemic. But that's the first group, a small group of winners. The second sector is the set of sectors that are rebounding. They might have had to shut down initially or change their business model dramatically, such as restaurants closing down or only serving outside. But some have been able to reopen. And as part of that reopening, they may be calling workers back or even hiring new workers. These sectors have rebounded, hurt hard initially, but are now readjusting back to being open again. And again, recalling or even hiring back workers. We're seeing a lot of hiring on our site in these rebounding sectors. Third are the damaged sectors. These are sectors that really depend on travel, especially air travel, and may not recover for a while. Hospitality, tourism, the arts and entertainment, sports, and other sectors that depend on large groups of people coming together have seen employment and job postings fall by close to half in the US on our site and in government data. Again, these are sectors that shut down initially, but haven't seen a rebound and may not for some time. The fourth sector that I focused on in this pandemic, I'm going to call the paused sector. These are sectors where hiring is on hold, even though they haven't laid many people off. Tech, finance, other professional services are all good examples of the paused sector. These tend to be higher wage jobs, the types of jobs where companies don't hire and fire quickly. It takes longer to find their workers. They often are more specialized. They get higher salaries. These are companies that may be reluctant to lay people off because it's so expensive to find new workers. And so instead, they do less firing, but also have done much less hiring during this period. And they may wait to hire even after other sectors of the economy rebound because they are waiting for more economic confidence longer term in the economy. I think of some of these paused sectors as a good guide to how much economic confidence there is among employers. And there's a bit of a paradox. Some of these high wage sectors are those that haven't seen much job loss. Employment isn't down very much in sectors like tech or finance, but hiring has fallen in these sectors significantly, more so than in many of the rebounding sectors. Again, these are sectors that have paused. They're not firing, but they're not hiring. So that's where when we look at where the recruiting activity is and where the jobs are, some of these sectors that where people can work from home, they're not the sectors that we think of as hurt most by the pandemic, still have slowed way down on hiring. And that's what we see today when we look at the labor market and try to understand different sectors. So when we look bigger picture, we see there are some ways that this recession really is dramatically different than other recessions that we've seen in recent decades. One way that this recession is different is it started with services sectors. Hospitality and tourism was the sector that was hurt most and hardest by the virus because people were rightly concerned about travel. Typically, most recessions start with goods-related sectors like energy or housing, sometimes with finance, but rarely with services. Another way that this recession really is so different is that it's a big city recession. When we look in the US, job postings are down most in places like New York and the San Francisco Bay Area. In the UK, job postings are down more in London than any other region. We usually think of these large, rich, diverse metros as more immune to the ups and downs in the economy than places that might be more dependent on a single industry or a single company even. But in this recession, a lot of the industries that are hardest hit tend to be more urban industries. And so that's why this is more of a big city recession. That also makes this recession different. The third way in which this recession really does feel different is, at least initially, so much of the unemployment was expected to be temporary. Many businesses, especially lower wage businesses, furloughed their employees and expected to recall them. Back in April, the US government reported that almost 80% of the unemployed said that their job loss was likely to be temporary. We've never seen a recession where such a high share of temporary unemployment. Now, as the months go on, some of those temporary layoffs have indeed ended and people have gone back to work. Sadly, some of those temporary layoffs have turned permanent. Temporary unemployment has come down, and that's why the headline unemployment in the US has fallen. But at the same time, measures that focus on permanent employment have gone up and stayed stubbornly high. So this dynamic of shifting from temporary to permanent unemployment is another way in which this recession really is different. This recession is also different because we're in the acute phase that may be followed by a chronic phase. The acute phase of this recession that we're in right now is when the virus is not yet under control and our day-to-day activities are dramatically changed by the virus. People working from home, restaurants, retail, other businesses operating at low capacity, far fewer people flying. But if there were a vaccine tomorrow that magically wiped out the virus, the economy would not now snap right back to where it was before the pandemic. We have done some chronic damage to the economy because we've been in this acute phase for so long. People have lost their jobs, businesses have closed. It takes time to recover from this kind of acute crisis. It's like a crash on the highway. The traffic backup lasts for hours after the crash gets cleared. It takes time for all the pieces to get back in motion because every piece depends on every other piece. So that means that even if there were a vaccine tomorrow, we're likely to be in a longer-term slowdown for some period of time. And that has implications for the job search and recruiting process. When you think about what has happened in this recession for job seekers, you can imagine that some job seekers now are desperate to find work. Those who've lost their jobs, who fear the loss of income, in the US who might lose their health insurance, are especially desperate to find work. But in times of uncertainty, and at the start of the recession, other people are more likely to stay put if they have a good enough job. A recession is not a time when people want to be the last one hired at a new job. And in past recessions, we see far fewer people quitting their jobs voluntarily and taking on new opportunities because they want to hold on to the certainty that they have. So that means that there are probably more people who are searching for jobs because they need to, but perhaps fewer who are just searching for a better opportunity because they want to, at least for now, until there's more certainty in the economy. Overall, from the perspective of the job seeker, the labor market's more competitive in the sense that there are more job seekers today for every job opening than there were at the start of the pandemic. That's a big change from the years of the tight labor market that we had before the pandemic started. We had many years where there were relatively few job seekers for every job opening because the economy had been doing so well in many countries and the unemployment rate had fallen in some cases to historic lows. In that kind of tight labor market, it shifted bargaining power to workers because there are fewer job seekers for every opening. But that tight labor market now is over, and it's probably not going to come back for many years, given what we see from forecasts by the US Fed and others. Now there are more job seekers for every opening. It makes it more difficult for job seekers to find work, but it means recruiters who are hiring that they may find more job seekers per opening than they were used to before the pandemic. Now, a possible long-term change from this pandemic is a shift to remote work. That's certainly a short-term change. As part of the pandemic, many people who typically worked most of their days in offices are now working from home. It's been a surprisingly positive experience for many people based on surveys. Lots of employees and their employers say that people are more productive than they expected. But we need to keep in mind that remote work isn't as widespread as you might guess from the types of people who are attending virtual conferences like this one. A US estimate suggests that only about 37% of people are in jobs that can be done from home. And some government research suggests that among people with a college education, more than half are teleworking because of the pandemic. But for people with a high school degree or less, it's only about 1 in 10 people who are teleworking during this pandemic. So being able to work remotely is a luxury, one that is enjoyed much more by people with higher salaries and more education. And it depends on your industry, your job, and your household setup. Remote work is a lot more productive if you've got a big house with lots of quiet space than if you're sharing a small apartment with roommates or trying to school your children at home at the same time. Now, one big question is whether remote work will become more or less productive and more or less pleasant the longer we do it. And there are arguments in both directions. There are some people who expect that remote work will get better over time, and it might as we invest in tools that give us better remote work setups at home, and as businesses adjust their processes and expectations to accommodate remote work, thinking differently about meetings and internal conferences and documentation and collaboration. So in short, we might learn to do remote work better the longer we do it. The other argument, though, is that remote work could get worse over time the longer it goes on. A couple reasons for that. One is that it is easier to maintain relationships remotely and virtually than it is to build new ones. We're still living off a lot of the relationships that we've built for years or decades with our colleagues and our peers. Some of that social capital will diminish over time. The second reason why remote work might get worse over time is that as some people start going back to the office, others might start to have a fear of missing out. They might feel a disadvantage working at home if some of their colleagues are back in the office or if some of their competitors are seeing clients in person. So in this period where lots of people suddenly had to work remotely, it might turn out to be more productive than when some people or some companies start going back to the office and others start feeling pressure to do so also. Now, remote work depends on the details. It really matters whether remote work truly means permanently working 100% of the time from wherever you want, as opposed to working from home most days, but still having to go into the office once a week or every other week, and therefore needing to live within commuting distance. In a world where people are truly 100% remote, it may be possible to hire anyone located anywhere. That could be great for recruiters trying to fill really hard to find roles for people with incredibly specialized skills who might not exist in your local market. But for other recruiters, moving to 100% remote work could mean a huge number of applicants for every job if you don't need to be in the same local area as the job in order to apply. So the effect of remote work on recruiting could depend a lot on how specialized or general that job is. Finally, I'd like to spend a few minutes about what these trends from the pandemic and remote work mean for inequality, diversity, and inclusion, which is a big focus for us here at Indeed. The acute phase of this pandemic has been a challenge, most of all for lower wage industries and people with less education, who are less likely to be in jobs where they can work from home, more likely to be in some of the hard hit sectors like leisure, hospitality, and personal services, and of course, have less of a financial cushion if they leave their job. The chronic phase that might follow also could aggravate inequality. That's because recessions historically tend to widen existing gaps. They tend to widen gender and racial and ethnic gaps, while boom times and tight labor markets tend to help the disadvantaged most. So unfortunately, both the acute phase of this pandemic and the chronic slowdown that might last afterward might aggravate inequality. What about remote work and remote hiring? Definitely the case that remote hiring could open up opportunities for some people who might not be able to afford to live where some jobs are, or might have care or other personal responsibilities that prevent them from moving. And no question that remote work can create opportunities for people who have care responsibilities at home and may not be able to be in an office, standard office hours, or people who have limited physical mobility. However, remote work could also aggravate some existing inequalities. It's possible that remote work will disadvantage people who don't have as comfortable or productive a setup at home. If they don't have the space or they live where internet bandwidth is weaker, they may not be able to work as productively as people who have a big comfortable home with fast Wi-Fi throughout their house. And it may especially be a challenge for newer hires who don't know corporate culture as well, or people earlier in their career who haven't already spent years in person, going to conferences, working with colleagues, building up their networks. So it's possible that remote work, even while it opens up opportunities for people who may not be able to afford to live where good jobs are, at the same time, remote work could aggravate some inequalities, especially between those with more and less experience in their career. So let me wrap up. 4 key points. First, it's really hard in this pandemic to generalize about what's happening in the labor market, either across sectors, across jobs, or about people. There are a few sectors that are doing incredibly well in this pandemic, some that struggled and rebounded, others that started struggling and continue to. So it's essential to understand which sector, which people we're talking about to understand this crisis. And the second point is this recession really is different. When we think about temporary work, the effect on big cities, the fact that it started with services, these are ways in which this recession, this pandemic, are really unlike anything we've ever seen before. Third key point is that some of this economic challenge won't end the day a vaccine comes. Even when the acute crisis is behind us, we're still likely to have some chronic damage with a slow recovery. And the last point I want to sum up with is on remote work. I expect remote work will continue. Lots of people will work remotely much more than they ever did before the pandemic. But it might not be the cure-all that some people expect. It might introduce some new recruiting challenges. It might aggravate inequalities that already exist. It'll open up opportunities for some and create challenges for others. Thanks very much. It was good talking to you today. Enjoy the rest of the conference.